Thanks for listening to the Woodward Podcast Network. Check out more shows by searching for us on Spreaker or wherever you catch your podcasts. The Woodward Podcast Network with Krupka Dental Associates.
This is Dr. John Krupka with Krupka Dental. Orthodontics is more than creating a beautiful smile. We provide ortho and airway evaluations which can reveal developmental and behavioral issues. Orthodontic treatment is now faster, more comfortable, and effective than ever before. Visit krupkadental.com.
Good morning. Welcome to Fresh Take for Tuesday, August 3rd. I'm your host, Josh Duclo, with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. Glad to have you with us on this sunshiny August morning. Feeling like summer, no doubt. Gotta love it. And we got our man, Zach Morris, working the boards for us in the Myron Construction Studio this morning. Good morning, Zach.
Good morning, Josh.
How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well.
Excellent. Are you, I have to ask every once in a while, you staying on top of like the lawn mowing and stuff like that? Have you been keeping on top of that? Or are you kind of letting it get a little longer since it's been drier? Any thoughts?
Once a week still. So it's been at the same rate pretty much for the last, let's say, a couple months.
Okay, you've been keeping it regular. Every once in a while, I've been skipping a weekend and letting it get a little longer and just kind of keep it healthy, avoid scalping it or letting it get too short. But I do notice that when you let it go a little bit, those sort of big burly weeds kind of pop up. You let it go a little too long and all of a sudden they sort of establish themselves. I try to stay on top of the weed pulling, even if I'm not going to get the lawn mowed. But, you know, sometimes nature's just going to do what nature's going to do. So you just got to, sometimes we're along for the ride, I think. And maybe that's relevant to the topics we're discussing today. You'll have to decide for yourself. It is our local news chat. And on this Tuesday morning, we are thrilled to be welcome once again to the show, Aisha Morales from Action 2 News this morning. The local news chat is brought to you, as always, by Settlers Bank. Good morning, Aisha.
Good morning, Josh. How's it going?
I'm doing pretty well today. How are you?
Not bad. Doing good.
Good. I know we've got like some slightly hotter temperatures than we've seen recently, and you're always down for the hot weather, right?
Yeah, and I actually just got back from Phoenix, so I'm not so sure that I would say I'm down with it. It was just unbearable. I was happy to be back.
Was it really, really hot while you were there? I mean, triple digits?
Yeah. It was, yes, it was about 107 or so, 110 with the heat index, so.
Yeah. Yikes. Well,
yeah.
We in Wisconsin, we have plenty to complain about here with the mosquitoes and the humidity and other things,
Right.
But we don't necessarily have that to worry about,
Exactly.
those extreme levels of heat. That's something those sun devils in Arizona like to enjoy.
Exactly.
Oh, Aisha, well, I'm glad you're with us this morning, and we do have some important news to discuss this morning. Of course, we've been hearing for a couple of weeks now about rising COVID case numbers across the United States. We're now beginning to see this much more noticeably here in Wisconsin as well, with the State Department of Health Services reporting the latest numbers here. What do those latest numbers look like?
Yeah, so the DHS is talking about those cases going up. So just to put some numbers to it, there were 622,866 confirmed cases on Monday. So that was an increase of just about 2,000 since Friday's report. So just a couple of days later, it went up by 2,000, which we haven't seen a jump like that in a little while. So it was kind of shocking to see that. And there were 1,027 new confirmed cases after Friday's report. So it was just, pretty impressive to see that. And if anybody was watching this morning, we did have Dr. Ashok Rai back on the show. So he was, talking about the increase as well and talking about the Delta variant. And he called it a disease of the unvaccinated. So he's pretty concerned right now.
Well, that's something we keep hearing is that so many of these cases are among those who have not gotten vaccinated. And we do have a little bit of good news on the vaccination front as well, with that number beginning to climb again. According to DHS, more than 10,000 people received their first vaccine shot since last Friday. So again, in just a couple of days, vaccinators reported 10,616 more people receiving at least one dose since Friday, and 6,000 people completing their vaccine series. So we're now over the 52% mark of the population getting at least one dose, and still just shy, 49.4% of Wisconsin adults who are fully vaccinated. Hold on, I got to make sure I get that right. Of Wisconsinites who are fully vaccinated. So that's not just among adults. So we got to make sure we keep those numbers distinct. So we are seeing, as these case numbers climb back up, maybe some people who are holding off on the vaccine deciding that now's the time.
Yeah, I think that's maybe what's happening.
Yeah.
But we were talking this morning about the CDC COVID data tracker map, which we've shown before, and we were showing it on the show this morning. And Brown County, this area has turned into an orange-ish red color, which is just showing those case numbers going up. And places like Shawano County is in the bright red there. So he's really urging people, if you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated, because the amount of people coming into the hospital that they're treating, it's very, very rare that it's people that are vaccinated that have gotten the COVID shot coming into the hospital. So,
and that's what we're hearing from the CBS News, on ABC News. Like all the national reports are that the gigantic majority, 90+% of these infections, and especially when you reach the point of a severe illness requiring hospitalization, that those are folks who have not gotten vaccinated yet. So hopefully that does provide some encouragement for people who haven't yet gotten that vaccine to go get that jab and give themselves that extra level of protection that the vaccine does provide. Of course, no vaccine for anything is perfect, but it provides an incredibly enhanced level of protection. And that's the thing, is what we're all looking for is protection, right? Defense, some type of safeguard against infection, and the vaccine provides that. Or if you do get infected, your symptoms are much less severe. In fact, I have a close friend who just let me know this morning that they just tested positive, and luckily they are vaccinated. And so their symptoms are not that severe, but they know that they've got a few days of some unpleasantness ahead of them, but very grateful that they are vaccinated so that they aren't experiencing the worst that this disease has to offer. But the concern around cases, Aisha, not just drawing our attention to the case numbers and the vaccines, but to the return of a fixture. You and I talked a couple weeks ago about putting those masks in the drawer around 4th of July weekend. And they're starting to come back out, aren't they?
They are. And this morning we were talking about Mile of Music.
Just a couple days away.
Just a couple of days away. And that's when we this morning mentioned masking again, that promoters, even though it's back, which is awesome. I think it's really great.
Right.
And we talked about all the great reasons why it's so cool to have it back, you know, economically and just emotionally for people, all sorts of things. But yeah, the promoters are asking people that if you're going to be inside any of the venues, that if you're indoors, wear a mask if you can, whether you're vaccinated, not vaccinated, that we just need to protect everyone because it's going to be pretty busy with a lot of people heading out there.
Yeah, that's right. So they know for sure the Fox Cities PAC as an indoor venue and the Lawrence Memorial Chapel as an indoor venue, they are requiring masks of anyone who comes inside. The other indoor venues are often bars, restaurants, coffee shops, things like that. So there it's going to be up to each venue to decide if they want to require masks.
Yeah, no, but it's pretty exciting. We had I can't remember his name of the artist who was singing this morning, and I know a lot of people are excited as long as that we're keeping these things in mind, social distancing when and if you can. Just in case. Yeah, no, that's right. Every little bit of protection helps. Nothing is foolproof, but every effort is worth adding on top of the others. And the other thing about sort of indoor versus outdoor, Dave Willems here in the report at WBAY.com from Jason Zimmerman, talking about this year, more than half of the sets are actually scheduled to be played outdoors. Yeah. Where in typical years, only about 25% of the total sets are outdoors. So really trying to keep in mind that some people may not want to be at indoor venues and giving a lot more options for the outdoor shows. But that's it. Everybody's going to have to sort of gauge their own level of comfort and take the steps that are necessary for themselves. And I think that we're just like last year, we're kind of just rolling with it, making the necessary changes. And they obviously, from what I heard this morning, they were saying that they really thought this out both ways, whether or not, the cases are better or worse. They just want to make sure that they're doing the best for everybody that's headed out there. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody wants to stay safe while they're having fun. So we will see how that goes this weekend as we get closer to Mile of Music. We'll be talking a lot about it on tomorrow's show
And on Thursday, I've got some guest books. We'll be talking more about that here on Fresh Take. Last thing in our news chat this morning, Aisha, Neenah officials are asking kids and families to stay away from Keating Park. What motivated this strange advice? In the summer, we're supposed to be using the parks.
I know. I remember reading this morning, and I still have a few questions, but they were just saying there's stinging insects that are apparently hanging around the playground equipment. So they're just telling people to not go to Keating Park until they can get exterminators out there and get rid of these things. I'm just like, where are the pictures? I need to know what this bug looks like. I just in case.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go to this park, but what if they're somewhere else?
You don't want to go investigating yourself necessarily.
Yeah.
I should clarify, I mentioned Neenah officials. This is town of Neenah as opposed to city of Neenah. So we don't want anyone getting confused about where we're talking about here.
Town of Neenah.
Yes. Yeah. So working on getting some exterminators out there, saying a couple of days to let them do their work and clear out these stinging insects. But I can just imagine you show up to the park expecting a fun day and walk away or chased away perhaps by these stinging insects. You wonder if they're flying or what they might be. But yes, take heed, folks, in the town of Neenah. Stay away from Keating Park for a couple days. Let officials get out there and clear up those stinging insects. Ouch.
We had a viewer who mentioned that they had been stung or something, and she was being treated for a couple of days by this bug. So maybe if we get a picture, we'll let you guys know.
Yeah,
so you
please
can see
keep
what
us
it looks
posted.
like.
Yeah, we would love to know because we'll pass that information along. You just don't know what these things might be sometimes. And if she's been treated for a couple of days for the sting, that sounds pretty serious.
Exactly.
More than just a mosquito bite.
Yeah.
Which normally is what we're fending off here at this point of our summer. All right, Aisha Morales with Action 2 News this morning. You can catch her every morning with the Action 2 News this morning crew on WBAY, and she joins us every other Tuesday for our local news chat here on Fresh Take, brought to you by Settlers Bank. Aisha, we really appreciate it. Great to talk to you.
You too, Josh. Take care.
You too. When we come back, looking ahead to the fall, an important Wisconsin tradition doesn't happen on its own. It needs your help. I'll tell you more when we return with more Fresh Take after this on WHBY. Even though it's getting a little hot again, don't let that stop you from getting out and enjoying the outdoors. Yes, there are some stinging insects out in the world. Now, stay away from Keating Park because apparently they're pretty bad right there. But, the natural wonders of the outdoors, that's just one of the great reasons we love life here in Wisconsin. It's beautiful here. And we only get so much time to enjoy it unless, like me, you also enjoy the winter. Then we get to enjoy all year round here. But the summer is just special. But it also reminds us that there's, work to be done to enjoy the other parts of the year. This natural splendor, our rich natural resources, they don't just happen. One of the elements that make all this possible is, much maligned as they might be by some from time to time, the Department of Natural Resources. Yes, the DNR plays a lead role in managing and stewarding our natural resources. And one of the great Wisconsin traditions that we are all familiar with, whether you partake or not, is the annual November gun deer season, right? White-tailed deer, a big part of our natural heritage here, and a big part of our tourist economy. 600,000 plus people coming out in the woods for 9 days in November to see if they can't bag a buck or a doe. And that doesn't just happen. DNR is looking for citizen scientists for their annual Operation Deer Watch. If you live in an area where you might be spotting deer, the DNR wants to hear from you. They're asking residents to report sightings of deer, buck, doe, and fawn, from now until September 30th. This is an annual effort that the DNR puts together, Operation Deer Watch. The data that they gather from all corners of the state, all 72 counties, inform their collaboration and consultation with scientists and biologists on the reproductive status of the deer herd, right? They're trying to figure out how many deer are out there. One of the data points that they're trying to gather is the ratio of doe, that's female adult deer, to fawn, that is youth or immature white-tailed deer. So if you know how many potential mamas there are to babies out there, they can use that number. Apparently, I don't know how it works. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but apparently they use that to determine the size of the herd, and then that helps them in establishing the harvest quotas, right? Like how many licenses they're going to issue for hunters to go out and try to bag a deer. If you want to participate in Operation Deer Watch, you can actually get a tally sheet to print off at the DNR website, or you can report your sightings right there on the website, or there's also an option to use your smartphone. And the way that this works, frankly, is not that different than how any data collection effort works. The more data they have, the better. Right? The more data you have, the better you can understand what you're looking at. And so it's going to be necessary to get a pretty big number of these observers reporting their sightings. I suspect they've got people who are doing this year in and year out, every year, knowing they're in an area where these reports are coming in. They know to do this. But this might be something that you could do if you live in an area where you see wildlife. I didn't go and dig into all the details, but check it out on the DNR website. This might be something fun for you to do with the kids, or maybe get the grandkids involved in something like this. If you live in that kind of an area where you'd be spotting deer, have them be keeping track of how many they find of each kind and report that in to the DNR. That's going to help make sure that we have the right numbers in the formula to determine other numbers like the herd size and the harvest quotas. You know, and brings me yet again to this line drawing exercise. The DNR, I think, often gets caught up in these exact kind of issues, right? Where do you draw the line between private property where someone has all their rights unencumbered and a floodplain where perhaps some mandated mitigation measures might be necessary? That is literally a line drawing exercise. But so is something like setting a quota, whether that's for white-tailed deer or the gray wolf hunt that's now back in Wisconsin. Right? That number was set recently significantly lower than it was set the first time around because it was significantly exceeded the first time around, given the way reporting went and how all of that went down. They'd have to draw that line somewhere. And this really ticks people off sometimes. I don't know why or what motivates it. There's some people out there who just think that, like, just letting things go with no control or influence is the best way for everything. And there are things where, yes, if you just let it go naturally, it's going to be fine, or it's going to recover itself, or it'll, manage itself. There are things where natural equilibrium can be reached. But when you're talking about things like limited natural resources, uncontrolled or unrestrained harvest of those resources is an age-old economics problem called the tragedy of the commons, where if it's just free for everyone to use, you can guarantee that resource is going to be depleted in an early or inefficient way. It's not going to last because people are going to be frantically trying to get their share and end up over-consuming and exploit that resource. Again, this is an age-old economics issue, the tragedy of the commons. If you want to study more, you can Google that, tragedy of the commons. And that's why we need agencies like the DNR, lines drawn by lawmakers and officials and elsewhere. This is something we just have to do. We've got to be willing to draw these lines so that we can preserve and protect and steward our resources for the future. It's not because the DNR doesn't like nature. It's because they do like nature and they want it around for future generations. So go to the DNR website, look for Operation Deer Watch, and help them estimate the size of the deer herd before September 30th. There's your little project for the month of August and September. All right, we're changing gears significantly here. When we come back, I'm looking for your take on what seems to be a persistent political issue. That is partisan redistricting. We've voted on it many times. There's going to be a big controversy over redistricting again, you can guarantee. I'm curious to hear your take. Is this an issue? A lot of people make a big deal out of it, but maybe that's just noise. Do you think partisan redistricting is a problem? Share your take after the news. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. For your elder law and estate planning needs, call Sarah Kahns and Peter Harbach at 920-250-9959. Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to the show. It's Fresh Take. I'm Josh Duclo with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. Glad to have you with us. Glad to have our man, Zach Morris, working the boards for us on this sunny Tuesday morning in the Myron Construction Studio. And you got windows over there, Zach. Still sunny out there, right?
Oh, of course. It's summer.
It is summer, that's right. Well, I don't know. The clouds were rolling through. But yes, a beautiful day out there today. More First Alert weather forecast updates for you here this morning as we move along. But I'm looking for your take right now. I'm looking for that every morning after the 9 o'clock news. Your questions, your reactions, your thoughts, your take on one of the stories making news. And I'm digging a little deep here into the news. Frankly, not a whole lot of topical news to talk about if we don't want to talk about COVID, which we talked about yesterday. So instead, we're turning our attention to what feels like an age-old problem that maybe isn't as age-old as it seems. It's certainly high profile these days. And of course, I'm talking about partisan redistricting. We've seen legislative fights. We've seen Supreme Court cases. We've seen all kinds of referenda across our state insisting that that we should have nonpartisan redistricting. But I'm curious if you think that really is the problem. I've got a couple arguments for why I'm not sure that partisan redistricting is the problem we think it is, and that quote-unquote nonpartisan redistricting is actually the panacea some claim it to be. So I want to hear your take on partisan redistricting. Where does this rank in the problems in our politics right now? Right at the top, driving all the rest of the problems? Or is this one of those issues that kind of just gets made into something because it feels like we could actually control it? I mean, it is something we can control, right? We can change the rules. We can set the parameters for how we draw district lines every 10 years. But is this as big an issue as it is made out to be? I want to hear your take on partisan redistricting. Share your thoughts, your questions, your reactions, your experiences, your perspectives. Share your take on the Settlers Bank phone line. 281-1150 is that number, 281-1150. Join the conversation. Share your take right now. 281-1150. Is partisan redistricting really a problem? Or you can email me your take. Send that to freshtake1150@gmail.com. freshtake1150@gmail.com. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts on partisan redistricting. Later this hour, we welcome Matt Payette from the Department of Administration in Calumet County to express and explain the concerns that Calumet County leaders have around the timelines they'll have to complete their local redistricting process. Matt will tell us a little bit about what's required of county governments in the redistricting process, what that timing looks like. It's set forth in law, and why it might be difficult to meet those time requirements this year. And we'll talk about alternatives that could be pursued when Matt Payette from the Department of Administration in Calumet County joins us later this hour. Then next hour, we shift gears and turn our attention to the global stage when Professor Art Sear, the director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College, joins us. We'll talk about inflation, the effect it has both on the economy and on world security. And we'll also talk about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's in the news again, and not for good reasons. Professor Art Sear gives us the larger national security context of the withdrawal from Afghanistan before we wrap things up here for the day, as we always do, with the takeaway. Right now, I'm looking for your take. Is partisan redistricting a big problem in our politics, or is it exaggerated? Is this something that we point to because we think we can fix it? But if we tried to fix it and actually put in something new, we'd find that wasn't really the problem. I've got some theories here, and I'm looking to hear from you. Share your take on the Settlers Bank phone line, 281-1150. Joe is up first from Nina. Joe, thanks for your call. What's your take?
An old saying, if it's not broke, don't fix it. You know, if there was a real wide swing in votes, then I'd say you might need to do something about districting. But the vote in Wisconsin is so narrow. We had a 20,000 swing vote between Everts and Walker, and Trump got elected by 21,000, or got voted out as a result of about the same margin.
Yep.
I don't think we need to fix it. I really don't believe it.
All right. So Joe and Nina says not a problem. Now, I've heard from enough of the advocates on this issue to know their answer would be to, frankly, agree with Joe on the first part. to say, yes, we are evenly divided. We are very evenly divided between voters in two major parties, Democrats and Republicans. And there are, as Joe said, a couple tens of thousands of voters that switch back and forth. We saw that between 2016 and 2020 in the presidential race. We saw that with the governor's race in 2018. We do see these narrowly divided statewide races. But when you get down to the district level where these lines are actually drawn in the redistricting process, there, a state where votes are split pretty evenly, almost 50-50, or as Mike Ellis used to say, probably 47-47 with 6% floating in the middle. Yet somehow, because of how they draw the lines, Republican legislators are able to draw a map that gives them nearly a supermajority of seats in the legislature. Now, we've been over this before. There are standard tactics for how this is accomplished, and there are standard arguments for how it could be remedied. And one of those standard arguments is nonpartisan redistricting. You just take the power away from partisans. That would be the party members who are elected to the legislature or the governor. These are some of the alternatives, right? The governor could draw the map. And I suspect a Democratic governor would draw a map heavily favoring Democrats. Now, our system doesn't allow for that, although Governor Tony Evers has created what he calls the People's Maps Commission. They're going to be submitting maps to this process of redistricting alongside the ones that the legislature puts forward, because you can just guarantee whatever the legislature comes up with, the governor will veto it, and then it will go to the courts, as it almost always has in the history of our state. One of the reasons this is a huge issue here is because in 2010, the last time that redistricting was undertaken, technically 2011, following the 2010 census, we had unified control of the legislature and the governor's office with one party. Republicans controlled all three. The state Senate, the assembly, and the governor's office were all in Republican control. And so they could agree on the map they wanted to draw. And that at a time when these techniques for drawing the maps were getting far more technically advanced, right? Breaking down not just counties, not just wards. You could really get into the data and know who was where, and when you were moving a ward from one district to the next, they had high levels of confidence about what that effect would be on the overall vote outcome. And so even if overall in the state you have a relatively even distribution of votes, it's possible by how you draw the lines to pack a lot of one party into a district so it's not really competitive, but then you're putting a whole lot of that party's voters into one district, right? So if we're 50-50, but one district actually has 90% Democrats in it, well, those are fewer Democrats to vote in surrounding districts. That is called packing. Or one of the techniques called cracking. You could take concentrations of voters who all share the same partisan philosophy, and you distribute them over a bunch of other districts where you're diluting their political power by splitting them up. So cracking by splitting up concentrations of voters, or packing by concentrating voters into one or a small number of districts, are two traditional tactics for how partisan redistricting influences and can potentially, arguably, skew the balance of partisan power in a state by how you draw the lines. So that is the argument for why it is a problem. Kristen chiming in, saying gerrymandering is absolutely an issue at both the state and national level. How can the voters actually hold politicians accountable if they come from districts they can't lose in? When partisans are in charge of drawing the maps, then the partisan actors have more of an influence in the voting process than the actual voter. So I get Kristen's argument. I hear this argument all the time. I disagree. I'm not saying it's not an issue. It is an issue, but I don't think it's the issue that the advocates are making it out to be, right? This whole idea of the politicians are choosing their voters, not the other way around. I mean, kind of, but only once every 10 years. And they draw the lines, but it's up to voters to choose who they want to vote for. And here's something I think we often overlook. It's up to parties to nominate candidates that voters actually want to vote for. I think we very much overlook the power of the personality of a candidate to actually break through some of the partisan stalemate. Now, one of the forces working against that is many voters don't vote, right? Particularly in off-cycle races, midterm election years, etc. We have really low voter turnout, relatively speaking, and that doesn't help. Because then even those who do vote oftentimes don't get informed, right? They just know they are a Republican or they are a Democrat, and so that's how they vote. And so partisan loyalty, I think, is also an issue. If you didn't have that, if you had voters who actually cared about like the issues and actually educated themselves, the maps wouldn't hold the power that they claim the maps hold. Right? If people actually voted on issues instead of just blindly supporting a party, this wouldn't be an issue. But that is how voters often vote. And so now we're left with the question, how do you fix it? John writing in to tell me that redistricting only became a major issue, he says, after Democrats adopted dense urbanization as their social policy, compacting their voters into ever smaller areas that are contained in a dwindling number of districts. So the question becomes, should cities be split up like slices of pie, with small slivers expanding out into huge wedges covering adjoining rural areas? Or should they remain in a smaller number of contiguous blocks? That is really the question about this whole cracking and packing, right? You can create districts that concentrate voters, and then it seems as though their political power is underrepresented, or you can dilute them, which basically eliminates their political influence in their district at all because they are overwhelmed by the numbers from the other side. But again, in an evenly divided state, you can only do that so much, right? You can only manipulate these lines to a certain extent. And even after the horrendous partisan redistricting of 2010, we still see districts changing hands. Not a lot, but it does happen. So convince me that partisan gerrymandering is actually the big problem that people make it out to be. I'm not convinced. I think there are other problems that are driving this, and we're pointing fingers at partisan redistricting because it feels like something we can fix. I want to hear your take on partisan redistricting. Join the conversation on the Settlers Bank phone line, 281-1150. We'll come back with Julie's call right after this with more of your take here on WHBY. In about 10 minutes here on Fresh Take, we'll explore the impossible position county governments are in to meet their legally required redistricting obligations when Matt Payette from the Department of Administration in Calumet County joins us. But right now I'm looking for your take on partisan redistricting. Is it a problem, and is nonpartisan redistricting even possible? Julie dropped off during the break. Julie, if you're still listening, give us a call. Settlers Bank phone line open for you, 281-1150. If you want to share your take on partisan redistricting, 281-1150. I got an email here from Clinton who says, Josh, statewide, Democrats can win statewide election races. Republican control of the state Senate is by a narrow majority, but Republican control of the state Assembly is just under 2/3. You see, the smaller the district, the easier it is to select specific partisan constituents. Yep, and I can't argue with that, Clinton. That is a compelling reason for evidence that partisan redistricting can produce results, right? That the Republicans, because they got to draw the most recent map, that they were able to achieve partisan control. I guess my response to that one is to say, wouldn't Democrats do the same thing? And let's play this out. Clinton says, sure. So then let's eliminate partisan redistricting. Who knows and cares enough about this issue that they could do this and not have an interest in it, right? That they would do it and be objective. I just don't know that we could find those people. And my evidence for that is other states who try to do this that still have partisan districting. That's just what I've seen. I want to hear from you. Share your thoughts. Julie is back. Julie, thanks for the call back. Thanks for joining us and sharing your take on the Settlers Bank phone line. What's on your mind?
Well, I can't say that it's not a broken system. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. We're having problems with unfunded mandates, and our people that are elected in there, they're not responding to us. They're just answering the party line instead of thinking and doing as we elected them to have their own mind and position on things.
Yeah.
Fair maps, when we're looking at Appleton, when it once was one district, now it's split into 3. So when I'm a rural person and I'm caring about the roads out in my area or other issues, why would I be concerned about transit services in the Fox City? That's why you have your areas. You make your maps built around your issues So you're looking for the person who's going to address your issues, not somebody else's.
Yeah, Julie, really good thoughts on that. I'm running out of time here, but I appreciate you calling back and sharing those thoughts, because Julie's talking about when you're mixing different constituencies in one district, right? She's talking about if you live outside of the Fox cities and part of your district includes the Fox cities, well, then who's really being represented? Who's being heard in a district like that? And that gets to the point Mike is making in an email here in my inbox. Mike writes, all I needed to do was look at the shape of some of the districts on a map. You can't tell me it's not a problem. Also, if it was not a problem or an advantage to whichever party's in power at the time the maps are drawn, there would be no argument. It is a major problem, but one of many, Mike writes. Ballot access, campaign finance, etc. could be as big. So Mike making the case that the shapes of the districts themselves show us that this is a problem. But this gets back to the point that John was making in the email earlier about these wedges, right? That gets to Julie's point as well. Because you really have to ask, what does a quote-unquote fair map look like? How would we know one if we saw one? What would it have to do? Because we're applying the same principles in this state during partisan redistricting that nonpartisan redistricting commissions also say they're applying. Things like compactness, completeness, preserving common constituencies, right? That's what Julie was getting at. And Mike's talking about the shapes of these districts, proving that they're a problem. But if you are trying to draw 99 competitive assembly districts, if you want every single one of them to be competitive, you're going to see some really wacky shapes of districts, because we have chosen to sort ourselves. Certain communities are one-sided. So now you ask the question, well, okay, so then would nonpartisan redistricting have maybe 1/3 safe seats for Republicans, 1/3 safe seats for Democrats, and 1/3 competitive seats? I mean, sure, I guess. But why not 25-25-50? Why not 40-40-20? Right? And when you put even nonpartisans in charge of this, they're going to have to deal with these issues. I guarantee you a nonpartisan redistricting commission would come up with district shapes just as wacky as some of those you see right now. But it would be in service of a different goal, one ostensibly geared towards quote-unquote fairness. But again, I'm just not sure what that means in this context. Does that mean every seat is competitive? Does that mean any district could be won by either party anytime? Because I don't think that's realistic, given the partisan sorting that we have done physically. Like where we live, we are surrounded by people like us. That's true for most communities in nearly every state. And so to draw a map that is going to make competitive districts, I don't think that's realistic unless you use some really bizarre shapes where you're including very different communities in one district. And that violates the spirit of redistricting. So I don't know how we get quote-unquote fair maps that don't provide at least some advantage to someone, because someone's drawing that map, and every one of us have an interest in politics, or we wouldn't care enough to be involved in the process. I have an interest. It's not with a party, but it's with other things. So even if I was drawing the maps, I'd have an interest, and it'd be reflected in that map. So to think that there's some magic group of people out there who can come up with these objectively nonpartisan, quote-unquote fair maps is a fantasy as far as I'm concerned. But it is one that's useful for advancing some political agendas and arguments and trying to cast the other side as the bad guys in this whole thing. I just think we're looking at the wrong issue here. To Mike's point, ballot access, campaign finance, these are at least as big as redistricting, and we don't see wave after wave of referenda and march and protest on that. So we'll see what happens. Democrats should really be focused on winning seats to try and gain a majority rather than whining about maps. And I've said that for years. That's not new. I've said that to Gordon Hintz, one of the loudest advocates for the unfairness of these current maps. I'm not going to argue that they don't have a partisan effect. I'm just not sure that you could eliminate that effect with the solutions that have been put on the table. So there's my last thoughts on that one. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the problems, issues, and possible solutions for partisan redistricting. But we got to leave it there for now, because when we come back, we're going to be joined by Matt Payette. He's with Calumet County, and Calumet County is very concerned right now about being able to meet their legally required deadlines for county redistricting. We'll talk about what they have to do and the timeline they have to do it when we return with Matt Payette of Calumet County here on Fresh Take. You're listening to WHBY. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. Find their offices in Oshkosh, Appleton, or Green Bay, or find them online at hooperlawoffice.com. For your elder law and estate planning needs, Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to the show. Glad to welcome to the show on the Settlers Bank phone line, Matt Payette with the Department of Administration in Calumet County. Matt, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, good morning, Josh.
So we're talking about redistricting, and I understand that leaders in Calumet County are concerned about the timeline that is playing out here for them to get their role in decennial redistricting done. Let's start by explaining what role county government plays in this decennial redistricting process based on state law.
Well, state law and Wisconsin statutes 5910 lays out a process, associated requirements, and a timeline for redistricting Calumet County. This is a nonpartisan process. It occurs every 10 years after the census is completed by the federal government, or the year after. So last year, everyone received notification from the Census Bureau to fill out information regarding population, race and ethnicity, and some other demographic information. That data is then taken and put into geographic units called census blocks and tracts, and those are the building blocks that the county uses for the county supervisory redistricting process. The statute 5910 lays out a timeline, and it's generally a 60-day timeline. So the year after the census is complete, counties receive data generally on April 1st. Once they receive that data on April 1st, they have 60 days to complete a tentative supervisory district plan, hold a public hearing, and adopt that temporary supervisory district plan. Once completed, that plan is forwarded to all the cities, villages, and towns within the county, and they have 60 days to create municipal wards and provide a ward plan. After that 60 days, that data is returned back to the county, and the county has 60 days to hold a public hearing, adjust the tentative plan, and adopt a final supervisory district plan. And this all needs to happen by December 1st, and that's a real key date in the whole process, and that's the date in which incumbents and residents interested in running for office can take out nomination papers in a district and have those papers circulated with signatures and become eligible to be placed on the spring ballot for the 2022 elections. So in order for nomination papers to be provided, the district actually has to exist.
Yeah.
And you have to live in that district, and the signatures on your nomination papers have to reside in that district.
Right.
So that's really a general overview of the process that we look at for a standard redistricting process in Calumet County.
And so it's clear that those lines need to be drawn before candidates can file the paperwork to be candidates for local office, because as you said, you've got to know where those lines are, where the district is, who lives in that district, to even be able to sign nomination papers. So we've talked a couple times on the show already about the delay in getting the census data from the federal government into the hands of locals. What does that look like right now? What's the latest you know about when that data might be coming?
Well, we were notified early in 2021 that the data we normally receive on April 1st, that we shouldn't expect that data any earlier than September 1st.
Wow.
Initial discussions that we've had with the state is that we will receive that data on August 24th. this delay, it creates an extremely truncated timeline when we look at that December 1st deadline.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking at a process that starts August 24th versus April 1st and ends on the same date, December 1st. It really leaves counties, cities, and villages and towns little room for error within the process or delay. Within the process, there's also requirements of Class 3 hearing requirements and special meetings that will be required to meet this deadline for cities, counties, and villages and towns. So, in general, this condenses an 8-month process into a 4-month process, which is really problematic for units of government.
Yeah, absolutely. And when this is such a hot button topic, right, so many people are interested in this, it's going to get a lot of attention. There's going to be a lot of public view on this and potentially a lot of people who want to try to spin what's going on one way or another to favor their side of the argument. So this is just a recipe for a real mess, Matt, as far as I can tell.
I agree, Josh. And it seems like anything with the word redistricting, voting,
elections.
It seems to be a political partisan lightning rod at this point.
Yeah.
And it's really good to point out that the county supervisory districts, it's a nonpartisan. You don't enter the ballot or be placed on a ballot as a Libertarian, a Republican, Democrat, or the Green Party. It's completely a nonpartisan process that we employ. But I think just the general nature of what we're doing brings that discussion brings a partisan discussion into a nonpartisan process.
Well, and having run for a nonpartisan office, a lot of voters refuse to believe there's such a thing as a nonpartisan office or a nonpartisan candidate. They want to know, okay, sure, but which one are you really? That's just part of the nonpartisan office reality right now. The Wisconsin legislature did pass a bill that would have delayed the implementation of new maps at the local level until 2022. That's my understanding of it. Correct me where I'm wrong. What did you think about that idea? Would that have addressed your concerns?
That would have addressed our concerns. That really was at the request of the counties. The majority, if not all counties within Wisconsin are members of the Wisconsin Counties Association. There's also the League of Wisconsin Municipalities that represents most towns and villages, or cities and villages, and then there's the Towns Association. So early in 2021, most units of government recognized this problem and tried to be proactive and find a solution that could serve counties, towns, villages, and cities. And we all have different timelines and different requirements, so there wasn't a perfect solution. But really, I think the bill attempted to, and it really did make the best out of a bad situation with the federal delay of the release of the data. So it really, the processes for all units of government are embedded within state statutes. So we don't really have any authority locally to come up with a legislative solution to this. Right. So it really would have had to happen through the state. And one really important consideration about the uniformity and what this bill would have done is there's cities like Appleton and Menasha and Kiel within Calumet County, but they all cross county lines. Right. So Menasha into Winnebago County, Appleton into Outagamie County, and Kiel into Manitowoc County. Well, if the bill would have provided a uniform timeline, it would be really hard for Appleton to complete their process if Outagamie and Calumet are on completely different timelines. We could complete our job and have it done by 2021 or by December 1st, but say Manitowoc doesn't do their half of Kiel by that same date, right. Kiel can't really proceed with their process.
Yeah. So there's
it in a nutshell, it's not a perfect solution. But it really, I believe, the bill made the best out of a bad situation. That bill was ultimately vetoed by the governor on July 9th, right. which really opened up some uncertainty with units of government.
And so it was with the veto of that bill that the level of concern really started to rise among some county officials, realizing sort of what you're up against and what's going to be required. So that's where we're going to begin when we come back after the break, Matt, is what alternative process you've laid out now, hoping to meet your statutory requirements within the actual time you have to do this. We're going to hear what that looks like and what other attempts could be made to try to address this issue legislatively or otherwise. We're talking with Matt Payette with the Department of Administration in Calumet County about the concern over timing of local redistricting timelines and requirements. We'll return with more talks about this when Fresh Take returns on WHBY. Real Local Radio, getting real about what census data delays mean for local redistricting efforts with Matt Payette from the Department of Administration in Calumet County. He's with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. So, Matt, in our last segment, you laid out what the statutes require local governments to do. You're not going to have the time to do all that stuff this year, are you? Or are you looking at sort of a condensed timeline? What does that look like?
At this point, we've developed a condensed timeline. We started at December 1st, and we moved back from there. So we know we want to hit December 1st. We want those districts ready for nomination papers, and we want those new districts to be employed for the 2022 spring elections.
Right.
And then we went back to August 24th when we anticipate the data, and we set milestones within that timeline for adopting the tentative supervisory district plan in the public hearing, sending that information to the cities, villages, and towns so they can create their wards and adjust wards and create their ward plans, and then returning that data to the county so we can adopt the final supervisory district plan. I mentioned the concern about the municipality or the cities that cross county lines. We did have a remote meeting with Winnebago County and Outagamie County and discuss the timeline, and it sounds like we're all on the same page. We're all going to try to make that December 1st deadline and get our data, our tentative plans to the cities and villages and towns in roughly the same timeline to make it easier on those local units of government. I've also talking to the Manitowoc County regarding that as well. And another thing that we're doing is we have a meeting this week with all our municipal clerks that have been invited to go over this timeline because they're going to have a condensed timeline within our timeline.
Sure.
And really want to discuss the process with them, offer any assistance that we may be able to provide as a county to them, and maybe drafting ward plans and assisting with that. And if there's anything that we can do to make the process a little bit easier on those local units of government.
Yeah. So this is really going to be sort of uncharted territory. You're collaborating county to municipal level to make sure what you're doing is going to flow into their process, and then what they do at the local level can flow back into your timing and try to get this all done by December 1st. But, I mean, Matt, it sounds like you're basically having to sort of come up with a plan from scratch here to fit this condensed timeline.
Yes, we really did, and we knew the key time, the deadline was December 1st.
Right.
So, in moving back and developing the timeline, we're going to do whatever we can. Statutorily, we're supposed to have a tentative supervisory district plan created 60 days after we receive the data, but no later than July 1st. So technically, we are in violation. Every county in the state is in violation of state statute right now. That draft bill that the governor vetoed would have alleviated that issue.
Sure.
But it's complete. This issue is completely out of our hands, and it's really due to that delay in census data. So we're going to try to truncate the timeline to not miss any more deadlines through our process.
Yeah, but that's a great point, though, is because of the delays we've already seen, we're already out of compliance with the statutorily dictated process for executing this decennial redistricting. So, I mean, has there been any legal advice provided to county leaders as far as what that could mean? Could someone bring legal action as a result of the not being in compliance with the law right now?
Josh, I'm not an attorney, and really WCA provided some legal guidance, and really it's a big question mark. if a community doesn't have new districts in place and they have to use old districts for the spring 2022 election, where could litigation arise from? And in this environment, it seems like there very well could be legal challenges no matter what happens. It's almost the legal abyss for a county. What do we do at this point if we can't meet these deadlines? Right. It's a very unique situation, and then it's completely out of our control. So, we're trying to hit as many deadlines as we can in this truncated process, but the legalities at this time are really undetermined.
Yeah, and the legislature's out of session, so even if they wanted to pass a bill, that would be sort of some extraordinary effort there on their part, and it's no guarantee the governor would sign it. So I guess let's set the process stuff aside for a second, Matt. There are a lot of questions right now among a small number of people who are wondering about the credibility, the accuracy, the faith they should have in our election system. This seems like not a great time to have the redistricting process also thrown into question. Even if it's for very legitimate and understandable reasons, this is not going to boost public confidence in the process, is it?
No, it adds another layer to a complex situation here, and it is a highly debated item right now, and an issue throughout the country, whether it's a federal, state, and the county process, and hopefully people understand that it's not partisan.
Right.
It's a nonpartisan process here at the county, but I still think that the situation could turn into that. Potentially.
Yeah, it feels like there's all these other forces swirling around, and now redistricting, which has already been so caught up in the partisan back and forth for the last decade, at least in this state, now combines on top of what's already, fear and concern and allegations of mismanagement and widespread mistrust. It just feels like kind of a confluence of factors here that could lead to some really messy outcomes. So let me ask you this. Have you contemplated what happens if you miss that December 1st deadline, if you can't have finalized districts in place by December 1st? Is there some sort of plan B or an emergency plan for what happens if you can't meet that December 1st deadline?
From my impression, if we don't, we would probably continue the process. We would miss the December 1st deadline, but we would be required then to use our existing supervisory districts that were developed in 2011 and adopted for the spring 2022 election.
Okay. But then continue the process in the background to have the new districts in place for whatever that next election is.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Well, this is...
I'll
go ahead.
Point out, Josh, for listeners, we did have a public informational meeting last week on this whole process and trying to explain the predicament we're in and the solutions that we're employing right now. We also have additional meetings coming up. One's on August 5th at the Calumet County Courthouse from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. And there's a meeting following that on August 13th from 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. in the same place in the Calumet County Courthouse. So anyone interested in learning more about this situation and the process that we're employing are more and want to provide input into that process and their thoughts are more than welcome to join.
Well, the best thing you're doing, Matt, is engaging the public, letting them know what's going on, what your plans are. I think that level of communication is necessary and essential to try to limit the potential nefarious influence that this big delay could have. You're handling it well. I really appreciate you joining us today and sharing so much of this detail. I've not seen this really reported anywhere, so I'm glad we were able to bring this to the public and share with them these opportunities for input. Matt Payette with the Department of Administration in Calumet County. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Josh.
Wow, what a mess. Okay, speaking of mess, when we come back, we're going to talk with Professor Art Sear about our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the effect of inflation. Stick around. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. Find their offices in Green Bay, Oshkosh, or Appleton, or find them online at hooperlawoffice.com. For your elder law and estate planning needs, Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to the show. It's Fresh Take. I'm your host, Josh Duclo, with conversations to get you thinking, not tell you what to think. Glad to have you with us this morning. Glad to have our man, Zach Morris, working the boards for us in the Myron Construction Studio. And glad to welcome back to the show Professor Art Sear. He's the director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College, and he's with us once again on the Settlers Bank phone line. Professor Sear, welcome back.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's fun to get these conversations from a little different perspective than we normally have. And your position as director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College has us thinking about the intersection of the global economy as well as national and international security concerns. So later on, we'll get to Afghanistan and the U.S. troop withdrawal from that theater. But we want to start with a big question that has been permeating political debates lately, and that's inflation. So let's start with the basics. Let's define what is inflation.
Inflation means, in practical terms, prices going up. Economists would say too much money chasing too few goods. So, in point of fact, it bids up prices.
So you've got a fixed set of things people can buy, and they have more money to pursue it. And so because they have more money, they can pay more for those scarce resources, and that drives the price up.
Yeah, they have to pay more. In the modern global economy especially, we don't have fixed sets of things, and it's a vast set of transactions. But, yeah, it's too much money chasing the goods available, so people have to pay more.
Right. Things you mentioned, we don't necessarily have fixed sets of goods, but sometimes we'll have things like supply constraints or, a pipeline gets hacked and suddenly you can't get gasoline to gas stations. Those are the sorts of things that can create momentary scarcity that can create inflation. Is that seen as something different than the kind of inflation that you're talking about?
Not basically, no. Okay. Economists talk in terms of demand push, but also demand pull, but supply push. Wages and salaries going up can, in effect, feed inflation as well. Again, we inevitably oversimplify life in order to get through it,
yes.
But in the modern economy especially, there's a huge number of factors in play.
Now, we'll talk about this a little more later, but basically for my entire life, since the early 1980s, inflation has been sort of a non-factor, but it's coming back in our political conversations. And one of the culprits that some people are pointing a finger at is increased government spending. So again, sticking pretty simple here, what's the logic behind that? How would increased government spending fuel inflation?
Well, it feeds demand within the economy, basically. Money supply is a factor in our economy overall, including inflation. And as I understand the process, I'm by no means an expert. If you increase federal spending aggressively, it can feed inflation. That's what happened in the 1960s, along with the fact you referred to bottlenecks. OPEC nations, oil producers, which are primarily, though not exclusively, Arab and Middle Eastern countries, they were able to get a stranglehold on the oil supplies such that they could get away with jacking up prices. So the very heavy spending, part of which was concealed from the public by President Johnson and Defense Secretary McNamara, in order to try to fund the Vietnam War without causing a lot of domestic disruption, while also pursuing the president's very aggressive domestic reform program termed the Great Society.
Sure.
That fed inflation, and the Arab oil shocks, as they were called, kicked in 73, tripling of oil prices, and then another big boost in 1979 further added to inflationary pressures. And we have not experienced that currently. I don't think anyone knows why for sure, but I'm convinced that one factor is the truly global nature of the economy. It's much harder than it was then to get a bottleneck in terms of basic supplies like petroleum.
So talk a little more about that. What has changed about the economy, the globalization of the economy, to maybe undermine some of those inflation factors?
Well, national borders are much less important. We have, again, vast movement globally in goods and services. It's a process that's much more automated. There's much less human labor involved, and no national economy is as significant as was the case in that earlier era. So my view is that globalization in that sense has been extremely beneficial. The U.S., the largest and richest and most powerful economy in practical terms in the world in the 60s and today, we are now a net oil producer and exporter. OPEC tried to, in effect, get a grip on oil supply and prices in 1960. They failed because they did not control the global market to the degree that they did in the 70s, partly because of greater efficiency and partly because of greater economy, especially in the private sector, spurred by the oil shocks of the 70s, and by exploring new sources of supply, spurred in part by what the OPEC nations did in the 70s. They have tried, but they have failed since the 70s to develop the kind of stranglehold that they had. I think that is probably in less obvious and less dramatic ways reflected in all kinds of other basic and manufactured product areas. A truly global economy is much more fluid and much more flexible.
And so you don't have those same pressures building that would lead to rising prices.
Yeah, I hope this is clear because it is extremely complicated.
Yeah, no, you're doing
You're
a great
right.
job.
You have to be an older person like me to have gone through inflation. It was truly frightening in the 70s. Jimmy Carter deserves credit in this area as in other important areas, including peace in the Middle East, that generally Carter doesn't get, but he nominated Paul Volcker as head of the Federal Reserve Board, and Volcker very courageously, after the free spending of the Nixon as well as Johnson years, Volcker reduced the money supply and significantly raised interest rates, and by the 80s had broken the back of inflation.
And that's the famous phrase there. Volcker came in to break the back of inflation, which at the time was ravaging the economy, double-digit inflation really. So talk a little bit about the practical effects of that level of inflation. Why is that such a problem in a society to have inflation at that level?
Well, it becomes self-reinforcing, and it's politically destabilizing. It has been the ruination of a wide range of countries, mostly non-industrial countries, especially in Latin America. Historically, people tend to point to Latin American dictatorships and their irresponsible economic policies as the kind of example we don't want to emulate. Germany in the 1920s experienced really hyperinflation. It leads to public fear and pursuit of extremist policies and governments. And those who are conservative and save, it tends to help borrowers and the profligate generally, because inflation means you're paying back whatever you borrowed in less valuable currencies or less valuable goods. It tends to penalize savers.
Right. If you're sitting on a big pool of savings, suddenly those dollars can buy less than they could before.
Yeah, I hope that's clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Fed currently, there's a very good article in the Wall Street Journal a day ago with a lot of detailed information on how very quietly the Fed, while downplaying publicly the dangers of inflation, they're keeping interest rates low, as we all know, whether you're a borrower or not. But in point of fact, the Fed has been reducing the money supply. We'll see. The June figures in terms of basic commodities and also finished goods indicates clearly inflation is underway. Yeah. Things like copper have been going up in price for a while, but 1 month doesn't mean that we're in the middle of an inflationary trend. And let's see what the Fed is currently doing.
Right.
And what data for the rest of the summer and into the fall indicate. There's certainly no reason for people to panic.
Right.
What I'm trying to communicate, I hope clearly, is that we're structurally in a very different situation from what the country and the world experienced in the 60s and 70s, late 60s and through the 70s.
And that's such an important reminder right now. People are talking as if we could return to that so quickly and easily if we don't take dramatic action. What I'm taking away from you, Professor Sear, is that while a lot structurally has changed, the sort of extreme inflation is unlikely, but that the prospect of inflation itself can't be ignored.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's important to study history.
Amen
and it's important not to underestimate the American people. The federal government has been engaging in heavy deficit spending during this century, starting with the dot-com crash and then the very serious global financial crash, which started in the U.S. 2007 to 9, and now in the face of the pandemic. But a president by the name of Bill Clinton in the 1990s found the economy was so strong and powerful, partly Volcker's legacy, that the federal government was running surpluses. People expect politicians to spend that money. In point of fact, Clinton, a very shrewd politician, obviously, and in that area, a very responsible public servant, Clinton actually paid down debt and held down federal spending and, in effect, returned that new value to taxpayers who had produced it. And I believe it was an important factor in his reelection in 1996 and his continued popularity till the end of his second term, despite his personal problems. So the people are smart and sophisticated in a general sense, and I'm quite confident, even if times aren't that hard, that there is a very powerful constituency for fiscal restraint in this country. It was a reversal of situations because the Democrats, starting with the New Deal, had rightly been seen as the relatively big spending, if not free spending policy, and Republicans used to be the fiscal conservatives. So the big spending that has gone on and the heavy fiscal deficits that have gone on throughout this century won't necessarily continue.
They may not be able to continue. We'll see what those circumstances look like. But we're going to talk when we come back, Professor Sear, a little more about other sort of non-direct spending policies that could have an influence on creating or minimizing inflation. We'll talk about things like rising wages and international tariffs. What factors could they play and exercise on inflation? And later we'll talk about withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan. What does that mean for our overall security picture? We're talking with Professor Art Sear, director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College. We'll talk more with him when we come back with more Fresh Take right after this on WHBY. In about 10 minutes here on Fresh Take, we'll weigh the costs and benefits of our withdrawal from Afghanistan. But right now, where are the real risks of inflation coming from? We're talking with Professor Art Sear, the director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College. And before the break, Professor, you were talking about some of the contributing factors that are pushing up inflation. You also talked about some of the global economic factors that are maybe suppressing a bit of inflation. So I want to think about some non-spending policies that might actually be influencing this, starting with tariffs. International trade tariffs had long been largely abandoned. They came back during the Trump administration. The Biden administration has been very reticent to repeal them. Do tariffs contribute to inflation, or are they limiting inflation? How do tariffs play a role?
Well, as economists like to say, it depends. They can be a factor suppressing inflation, but they also suppress production and employment. We had very high tariffs during the Great Depression, and in fact, the price level went down by 25%. That can be dangerous, too, because it leads to very, very high unemployment and a slowdown in economic activity, and in that era, especially real human misery. So tariffs aren't directly related to inflation, but the consensus among economists and policymakers and people generally today who are informed is that everybody's better off if you keep tariff barriers low. Right. The conventional wisdom back during the Great Depression era, especially during the Hoover administration, was that we should keep tariffs high. That protects our internal economic activities so we can produce more among ourselves and foreigners are taking less. In point of fact, it led to general economic slowdown. The conventional wisdom was also that we should reduce federal spending. We shouldn't engage in something that was seen quite alien at the time, fiscal stimulus, because that frees up private capital for investment. To be fair to poor old hapless Herbert Hoover, there were lots of relief measures during the Hoover administration, which, as people probably know, was just before the New Deal and the Democrats returned to power in a big way in the midst of the Great Depression. They were insufficient to really get the economy going again. In fairness, again, to Hoover and people generally at that time, the New Deal was very radical domestically, but we remained very protectionist. President Roosevelt generally stayed away, for understandable political reasons, from tinkering with the international trade system. Early in World War II, two very courageous leaders, Roosevelt again and Winston Churchill, initiated something called the Atlantic Charter, which was a declaration of how the world should be organized after the end of World War II and after victory was achieved. Mind you, they issued this pronouncement in August of 1941, when we were not yet a direct combatant, although there was a very active undeclared shooting war between American surface ships and German U-boats in the Atlantic. And we were doing our best to help Britain, but the Allies were losing. It shows real optimism and courage as well as far-sighted leadership. Again, to get to the point, they proposed a United Nations, and they proposed a structure that would work to keep tariffs low and encourage currency stability and other good things. A consensus had developed that protectionism was destructive, and also that the protectionist measures in Europe of the 20s and 30s had directly fed into the Nazi nightmare and Hitler and the Nazi Party coming to power in Germany. And the rest, of course, is history. Yeah. So we have a very different consensus today that's generally accepted in favor of relatively free trade. Now, with great bombast, President Trump has emphasized tariff and also non-tariff measures, especially directed against China. But in point of fact, my understanding of the reality is we are penalizing the Chinese, especially in legal terms, for intellectual theft and espionage and other things that really is outside the boundaries. But we have not raised protectionist barriers. Trump campaigned successfully, obviously, in terms of the Electoral College in 2016 by denouncing NAFTA and denouncing China and a lot of other things, and, of course, promising to build a wall, by which he was referring mainly to a physical wall. But in point of fact, what did the administration do? They renegotiated and updated NAFTA, and President Trump proceeded to congratulate himself for a victory in the Americas as well as against China. But in point of fact, it's not raising protectionist barriers. In point of fact, it's modernizing NAFTA. So I don't think he emphasized protectionism for political reasons, but in point of fact, the U.S. is part of the international free trade consensus that was developed by Churchill and Roosevelt and their staffs way back off the coast of Newfoundland in the summer of 41.
That's a really important
It's
reminder.
really an important point you make. Protectionism doesn't directly feed inflation, but it does feed a lot of other bad things.
Yeah. Well, we got to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to shift our attention to national and international security and our underway withdrawal from Afghanistan. We're hearing news reports about resurgent Taliban forces. What does this mean for U.S. national security and global security writ large? We'll talk about it with Professor Art Sear, director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College, when we return with more Fresh Take right after this on WHBY. Fresh Take is brought to you by Hooper Law Office. For your elder law and estate planning needs, call Peter Harbach and Sarah Kahns at 920-250-9959. Hooper Law Office, providing a pathway to your legacy. Welcome back to Fresh Take. I'm Josh Duclo with conversations to get you thinking, not to tell you what to think. And we're thinking about the early effects of removing U.S. troops from Afghanistan with Professor Art Sear, director of the Clausen Center for World Business at Carthage College. He's with us on the Settlers Bank phone line. Well, it was largely in response to voter pressure, as I can tell, Professor Sear. But President Biden announced he would be withdrawing all remaining U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Talk a little bit about how that's going and the effect it's having on the ground there.
Well, the decision to leave Afghanistan predates the Biden administration, as you and I know, and our listeners are aware too. President Trump gave major emphasis to withdrawing from our very, very large number of military commitments around the world, and to some extent he succeeded. We had, believe it or not, 200,000 of our military deployed in 170 countries around the world in 2017, and currently it's down to about 170,000 troops in around 140 countries. That's still a lot, but he did achieve that campaign pledge. So Biden, I think, is following a longer trend of American policy.
Sure.
You're quite right. Americans want to leave Afghanistan. My own view is it's certainly overdue for us to depart in terms of having a military force on the ground. My understanding is Biden, the decision was made to leave by September 11th for symbolic reasons. Biden, for, I think, prudent, practical reasons, understandably doesn't want to have the last forces leaving on that date, and we should be out by the end of the month, except for Marine Corps and other special personnel guarding the embassy.
Right.
And I'm sure we'll have some advisors on the ground.
But those diplomatic personnel still there with, military guards for the diplomatic facilities. Do you think this could end up like Saigon? Congressman Mike Gallagher was on the show last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, and he was worried about a Saigon moment as we begin pulling out, as we then leave behind diplomats, that the Taliban increases its control over cities, and that ultimately we're going to have to evacuate all of our personnel. Do you think that's likely?
I don't know. Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, the capital of the former South Vietnam, was overrun by North Vietnamese regulars. It's conceivable that could happen given the poor combat performance of the Afghan army troops, like the South Vietnamese. An enormous amount of money and time has been spent with state-of-the-art equipment and weapons and supplies and lots of training. In that sense, there could be a parallel, but I think that the differences between our experience in Vietnam and Afghanistan are really important, and in that sense, we're not going to have a Saigon moment. For one thing, there are important regional differences in Indochina, including between the north and south of Vietnam, believe it or not, quite predating our war there and even the French colonial experience. The Taliban in Afghanistan, insofar as these things can be measured, are uniformly unpopular and widely hated as well as feared among the population. That was not the case among the revolutionaries in Vietnam. There's no evidence that the Taliban has really permeated the established government, intelligence, communication, and supply in the degree to which the Viet Cong really did permeate the government of South Vietnam. And we're not so heavily tied in terms of prestige and commitment in Afghanistan as we were in Vietnam. So the short answer for a change from me is no. Even if there's some kind of dramatic fall of Kabul, it's not like Vietnam.
I see. So we have
Afghanistan is not a nation in any coherent sense. It's a set of provincial warlords. Again, a great contrast with South Vietnam and Vietnam overall, then or now.
That's an important point, and that's true. The federation or affiliation of local governments with the central government in Afghanistan is a very different thing than we normally think about as a nation state, where the central government really has authority and real power control in the outlying regions. And we're seeing that the Taliban is able to very quickly assert its power in rural areas and is now beginning to try to take control in concentrated urban centers where the government...
Oh, yeah, a very powerful, effective military force.
Right.
In that sense, there are some parallels with Vietnam. Sorry to be so long-winded.
No, not at all.
Probably the most important point, you always stimulate a lot of thinking. The most important point is we were on our own in South Vietnam. We had no broad alliance as we had in Korea and as we have in Afghanistan and as we had in the first Gulf War. Very courageous Australians and New Zealanders and 50,000 very tough South Korean troops were with us in Vietnam, but it was a unilateral exercise. In Afghanistan, it's a NATO operation, fully approved of and supported by the United Nations. That's the most important difference. We had to go in, and the international community, we do have a community that we didn't have during the Cold War. They were 110% behind us after 9/11. As our listeners know, the al-Qaeda factions that carried out the 9/11 terrorist attacks in our country were based in Afghanistan. Completely different from Vietnam in that sense.
Right, very true. So we a couple minutes left, Professor Cyr, and I want you to just give us the big picture on this. What does this movement of troops out of Afghanistan mean for our larger geostrategic and national security interests in that region and beyond?
Well, it means very little in terms of our geostrategic interests. Nobody has conquered Afghanistan. The Soviets, we did not go in and wouldn't have except for 9/11. The Soviets had a disastrous experience there, over 10 years of occupation. President Carter, again, to his great credit, provided direct aid and assistance, greatly reinforced by the Reagan administration, which provided Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen. My understanding is wherever you go in Afghanistan, even today, there are endless knocked-out Soviet tanks. These big, heavy helicopters litter the ground in urban, rural areas because of the tremendous effectiveness. The British lost the British were defeated 3 times. They lost one entire army back in the 1800s. One man survived, a physician. The Brits at the seacoast in South Asia, what is now India and Pakistan, thought he was a messenger. In fact, the Mujahideen left him alive so that he could tell the story of what happened to an entire army. It's a fool's game to think that you can take over and dramatically change Afghanistan. However, they have had reasonably honest elections. Women are participating in a way that never before happened, including in elections. So I do think there are winds of change in Afghanistan, just as there are throughout the world. But we shouldn't be there on the ground unless we really have to be. We're right to get out after 20 years.
So then you aren't thinking we're going to be back in there at some point very soon? That happened in Iraq. We pulled out. We go back. You don't think we'll be sending troops back to Afghanistan anytime soon?
Iraq was a purely voluntary invasion, despite efforts by the Bush people, especially Dick Cheney, to make a case that somehow they were involved in 9/11. That was bogus, and it is false. No, the two situations are very, very different. We had no choice about going into Afghanistan. If it becomes launching ground, an evil nest of terrorism again, we'll have to go back, and there'll be an international coalition with us. I'd be surprised if that happened. The Taliban is not really interested in launching international terrorism. They're interested in going back to medieval times. They're not going to be able to do it. They have to deal with all these warlords themselves. They're not going to be establishing national control. I'm quite confident CIA and other non-uniformed American personnel will not only be watching and listening, but also doing what we can to influence the local warlords, which is where the real power lies in Afghanistan.
And in that sense,
try to get them to avoid being criminal and try to get them to treat women in a decent fashion.
Yeah, exercise what influence we can on the ground through covert means, sort of a back to the future there, back when the Soviets were there. That's how we were operating in Afghanistan as well. We're all out of time, Professor Cyr. I always enjoy our conversations. You get me thinking and have me thinking all kinds of things here about Afghanistan and the future of that theater, and I will be thinking about it all day long. I always appreciate the conversations. Professor Art Cyr, Director of the Clawson Center for World Business at Carthage College, thanks so much for the time today.
Well, thank you. A real tonic. Really good for me. Thanks so much, Josh.
Fantastic. When we come back, we're wrapping things up for the day with the takeaway, so don't go away. More Fresh Take after this on WHBY. Breaking news from the WHBY News team right now. U.S. Venture Open cancels the dinner and reception next week as part of the U.S. Venture Open. That news just breaking as I'm coming back from break. You can learn more at WHBY.com. Get the story there. But clearly, COVID cases surging, having people reconsider. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about in today's takeaway. I have had so much fun with my dad at Fond du Lac Dock Spiders games this summer. I bought a ticket package for Christmas, and it was the best gift. It's a perfect location for us to meet in the middle. The price was right, and man, these teams are talented. That Northwoods League is good. But I got to be honest, the last couple of games, we did not sit in our assigned seats. The area where we have our tickets and our assigned seats is pretty crowded, and so we sat on the other end of the stands where there was more room, so we could spread out a little. Now, we are outside. My dad and I are both vaccinated, but spacing out gives us just a little bit of added protection from possible infection by the coronavirus. Now, obviously, not going to the game at all would offer even better protection. But we are not willing to give up that time we can spend together. We know we're taking a risk, but we're taking it smartly, right? We're taking it thoughtfully. And that's what I mean when I say that COVID precautions are a personal line drawing exercise. It's up to you where you draw that line between a smart risk you're willing to take and reckless behavior. So I'm wondering if your line on COVID precautions has moved lately. Because of these surging Delta variant cases, have you changed your behavior? Or think back to the spring. Maybe you moved your line more in the risk direction because things were getting better, right? Relative to 2020 anyway. The big idea here is that we are constantly drawing lines for ourselves, imposing limits, restrictions, making choices about what we will and won't do. Line drawing. And COVID precautions are just the most obvious case in our lives these days. We draw lines to protect our health and safety all the time in ways that have nothing to do with COVID. So it's worth thinking about what is dictating our decision, what's informing our choice about where we draw those lines. Right now, rising COVID case numbers, including among vaccinated people, is certainly informing people's actions. That information combines with other data and opinions, and that's how people decide what they're comfortable with, where they're going to draw that line. And it's not that different from choices we've made and decisions we've made for years. Think about winter in Wisconsin. If it's snowing really heavily, or maybe if you're feeling sick, you have a choice. Are you going to go out and try to get to work or get the kids to school? We know that it would be safer to stay at home. And we had that phase of our COVID era as well, right? In March of 2020, political leaders were determining the risk was just too great for people to go about their business normally. So they set rules that only allowed some jobs and workers to actually go to work. And so the work from home craze proliferated among some, not everyone. So what does that mean for future winters, right? What about the winter of 2022, 2023, and beyond? Are you going to be expected to work from home when you're sick? We already know that snow days are basically a thing of the past in many school districts. Instead, kids will have digital learning days. But after an entire year in many districts spent largely virtually, we all know that digital learning days are not as good as teaching in the classroom. Nobody thinks it's as good. Obviously, it works better for some than others, but generally speaking, it's not as good as doing it in person. And yet some districts stayed remote all year long, long after the science showed that there was a low risk of transmission. Then, maybe things are different now, maybe they'll be different in the fall. But the cost of virus spread, the risk of infections, was given much more weight in those calculations than other costs, like social isolation, lost instruction time, and the failure to master concepts that kids should be learning to move along with their education. Instead, schools and leaders prioritized COVID precautions over their educational mission. That is a line they drew, school district leaders, they drew those lines for you. Now consider work from home. Many workplaces are preparing to return to the office, even as we're seeing mask rules returning. So if we can work from home, why go back to the office? Well, because employers know they're losing something when most of their employees are working from home. Yeah, sure, you can get your tasks done in a rote sense. You can keep the process going forward, but you're missing out on something. Those random interactions, the creativity that comes from having people together. So what's that worth? Is the value of that spark of creativity worth enough to risk bringing workers back into the office? And who should decide that for you? After nearly 18 months of dealing with other people's lines, I hope we're starting to realize we're all capable of weighing risks for ourselves, and people come up with different conclusions for themselves than we might for ourselves. It's clear some people put more emphasis on the cost, the risk, over the benefit. But a cost-benefit analysis to be valuable requires a clear-eyed look at both. I studied cost-benefit analysis in graduate school, and the key to useful analysis is capturing the full picture of costs and benefits. Instead, in our society over the last year and a half, we've elevated one perspective, that is public health risk assessment, and ignored others, the social and emotional value of connection, for far too long, in my opinion. And now the lines are shifting again. There is plenty of public information available, and what's clear to me is now is the time to draw our lines. But we have to let people draw their lines for themselves if we expect them to observe the lines and the effect they are meant to have. That's reducing risk. That is a shared goal. But we cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy because we risk people not following the policy at all. And that's the takeaway. Got some more thoughts on this week. I hope you'll stay tuned. Join us tomorrow on Wednesday's show. Dan Rorty in for Karen Schneider. He is the editor of the Oshkosh Herald for our local news chat. I'll be looking for your take before we talk Bike to the Beat at Mile 8 of Mile of Music. Then Tom Kamenik from the Wisconsin Transparency Project is back talking about which public records are not open records. Join us for all of that and stay tuned. Focus Fox Valley with Haley 10 Pass is up next.
Hey, do you love a good story? Great. Then you got to check out the #Storytime podcast. Each episode brings you the craziest, creepiest, and cringiest stories from YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and beyond.
My story is about the time that I was broken up with at the 9/11 memorial. Twice.
Look, the internet is a dumpster full of stories, and I, your host, Will McFadden, dive in headfirst, sift through the flaming trash, and bring you nothing but treasures. Listen to all 21 episodes of #Storytime now on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.